My name is Erin Saltman. I am the Director of Programming at the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, based here in London. So please excuse the moody lighting. It is 11 p.m. here, and I know we've got some fielded experts from all over the world with various geographic scope and expertise that we've got joining us here. We've had some amazing panel discussions, but of course, I'm a little biased in saying that this is likely the best one you're going to be witnessing so far. We're going to have a really amazing discussion about some of the future forecasting trends. What are the adversarial shifts? What does the now look like, with a real focus on that nexus between extremism and technology? We have Dr. Alexandra with us, Dr. Alexandra Phelan. We have Dr. Amarnath Amarasingam, John Lewis, and Lawrence Mooley. I'm going to go one by one introducing them because I think it's worth you knowing exactly who they are, and ask each of our experts to speak for roughly 5 to 7 minutes with some opening remarks as you guys populate your questions into the Q&A box, and then we'll open it up as we go. But please feel free to ask as much as possible, because it's very rare that we get such an incredible group of people here on this panel. So to kick us off, Dr. Phelan is Deputy Director of the Monash Gender, Peace and Security Center and a lecturer in politics and international relations at Monash University. Alex's research at GPS focused on gendered approaches to understanding terrorism and political violence. Her research interests include insurgent governance and legitimation activities, insurgent women, political violence, illicit financing, and organized crime, with particular focus on Latin America. And she currently serves as a contributing editor for the journal Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, and is a Small Wars Journal El Centro Fellow. Dr. Phelan, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm handing over to you.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, GNET and GIFCT, for the invitation to come and talk here today about a little bit about some of my research. So my research focuses on two areas: gender and terrorism, and also Latin American non-state armed groups and organized crime, with particular focus on FARC and the Colombian conflict. So based on these themes, I'm increasingly concerned about two key issues regarding the interplay between technology, violent extremism, and militancy. The first is the relationship between technology and hostile beliefs towards women. And I'm really happy that this has actually been brought up quite a lot through this conference so far, specifically how violent extremist groups are actually using gendered online messaging to espouse misogynistic and sexist beliefs, which is really resulting in real-world harms for women. And the second dynamic I wanted to talk a little bit about today is the further strengthening of non-state actor governance of the terror crime nexus in some areas in Latin America. What we're starting to see is that some of these organizations are really beginning to diversify into different forms of illicit financing, including cryptocurrency, which is raising questions as to if this is actually going to be a viable trend going forward. So I guess the question becomes, are there threats with national, binational, and multinational crypto that terrorists can leverage and take advantage of? So firstly, in relation to misogyny and hostile beliefs, more and more research is being conducted into the relationship between gender and violent extremism, which is really needed and very positive. There's an understanding that women and men may be radicalized, recruited, and participate differently, and as we know, take on different roles within the group or movement. But some studies, including some of ours at Monash GPS, have also identified that there are many organizations that are deliberately using distinct gendered messaging directed towards women and men online, which can fuel radicalization and participation then in the offline space. I think what is really key to recognize, however, is that it's not just the messaging purely in relation to women and men's roles and the parameters of involvement within the movement, but it's also masculinities and femininities that are really playing a key role in influencing radicalization and participation. We often consider the political, socioeconomic, ideological, and sometimes religious factors that account for radicalization and participation, but for some reason we don't still seem to radically acknowledge or integrate the effects of gender power relations, gender norms, and gender ideology and identity as possibly distinct dynamics that are fused with some of these that can serve as radicalization factors within themselves. So where there continues to be a lapse in understanding, I feel, is the role of misogyny, sexist and hostile beliefs towards women in the LGBTI community that are espoused in some violent extremist groups. For example, in a study by some of my colleagues here at Monash GPS that focused on violent extremism in Indonesia, Bangladesh and the Philippines, it found that hostile sexist attitudes towards women and support for violence against women were actually the factors that were most strongly associated with support for violent extremism. So I guess whilst hostile beliefs towards women tend to be exemplified in the case of inceldom, where the ideology itself is inherently misogynistic, I think that there needs to be a stronger recognition that many far-right and jihadist groups have explicitly justified violence against women and promote this through messaging online. These result in real-world harms for women and really critical for understanding online-offline dynamics. For example, we know that branches of Amarnath have been responsible for publicly advocating sexual violence, violent assault, abuse and rape of women and women's supporters. And similarly to other far-right organisations, this has been legitimised specifically against the LGBTI community and women, including women with non-white partners, declaring them as race traders, race mixing whores, therefore justifying that they are legitimate targets. My concern is that until gender-sensitive approaches to responding to violent extremism are really truly integrated, the legitimization of violence against women and sexual assault may still be considered as distinct, even though such hostile beliefs are really quite intrinsic to the ideology of some violent extremist organizations that recruit and radicalize online. So I guess speaking to my second passion in my research, the notion of the terror crime nexus and also the realignment of militant non-state actors and their economic diversification in Latin America. And it really presents this question, I guess, recently of crypto and the role of crypto in funding violent extremist groups going forward. There have been, in the context of Latin America, some recent allegations and cases of cartels and terrorist organizations in the region selectively or partially using cryptocurrency to not only fund their activities, but also launder money from illicit activities, which then may signal our consideration in terms of future forecasting and response. So as many of you here would probably know, the conventional terror crime nexus view emphasizes this interplay between organized crime and terrorism, closely examining the links between illicit economic activities and militant non-state actors. The term is most commonly be applied to the use of crime by terrorist organizations as a source of funding, but it also relates to the formation of alliances between criminal and terrorist organizations. But I think in the context of Latin America, and it seems unfortunately to be getting a little bit stronger, is that in many respects, this nexus has been closely linked with proto-state governance, which has posed additional challenges. As a result, illicit crime can actually become intertwined into governance when these economic practices solidify, which then can be linked back to the state in some certain circumstances, which I'll talk about in a second. Research has begun to unpack the potential for terrorist and violent extremist organizations to use cryptocurrency for a variety of purposes, ranging from fundraising, operational and organizational funding, and in illegal drug and arms trafficking. I think that many of the studies have identified the pros and cons, suggesting that on most occasions, organizations probably on balance would not have a lot of motivation to engage in cryptocurrency. Probably right now there would be a couple of more cons. But there have been a couple of incidents recently in Latin America that may suggest a degree of diversification into crypto, particularly by way of illicit drug trafficking and money laundering. In fact, the DEA 2020 National Drug Threat Assessment has actually said that both Mexican and Colombian transnational criminal organizations were using crypto to launder illicit proceeds, particularly because of their anonymous nature and speed of transactions. For me, though, one of the more interesting cases that I think potentially could be a consideration going forward has to do with the series of indictments against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and officials within the government, including, interestingly, Josefit Ramirez Camacho, who is the superintendent of Venezuelan the Venezuela government cryptocurrency. Now, as many of you know, Venezuela has been suffering one of the worst economic crises and is increasingly turning towards cryptocurrency. And in fact, Venezuela has one of the highest rates of crypto in the world. But allegations here are really based around the relationship with FARC and the Cartel of the Sun's narco-terrorism conspiracy. So as some of you may know, Maduro is actually trying to revive attempts to roll out the petro, which was designed to be a cryptocurrency backed by Venezuela's oil reserves. So it's a little bit different to Bitcoin and other crypto. But in April of this year, key member of the opposition, Juan Guaido, said that Maduro was using cryptocurrency to finance FARC, among other methods, and to provide a safe haven for its funds. And similar allegations have been made about Maduro's alleged relationship with Hezbollah. Now, I need to stress that whilst these are allegations, it is quite well known that members of the Venezuelan government have actually been using cryptocurrencies as a way to bypass various OFAC sanctions. So I guess this does really begin to highlight some of the complexities of the terror crime nexus going forward, but also potentially how types of illicit financing can be solidified into both non-state actor and state actor activities. So I guess questions emerge, can national, binational, or multinational cryptocurrencies enable or constrain interactions? And can both states and terrorists potentially leverage these? So I think that's all I have for you now. I look forward to hearing some of your questions, and thank you, Erin.
I love the idea of you saying that's all I have for you now. We could go down so many rabbit holes with the topics you just brought up, and two really distinct different bubbles that have numerous rabbit holes to both. I mean, yes, just kind of reiterating that when we look at some of these trends, the idea that there's a lot of violent extremist overlap with the quote unquote manosphere and some of this misogyny, hate-based violence. And there's definitely been some articles over the years linking domestic violence trends with violent extremism, although I think one of the questions that we'll tease out is causality. So whether cause and effect, what indicates what. But also on this terror crime nexus, cryptocurrency. Again, cryptocurrency, a very sexy topic mixed with extremism, although it'll be interesting to see, future forecasting, what's the tipping point? Is it just that when normal people get more crypto, then bad actors inherently get more crypto as well? So we can bring that up in the Q&A. Without further ado, our second speaker, Dr. Amarnath Amarasingam, is an assistant professor in the School of Religion at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. He is also a senior research fellow based at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and an associate fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. His research interests are in processes of radicalization, terrorism and counterterrorism, diaspora politics, post-war reconstruction, and the sociology of religion. And I know you cover so many topics. I'm actually excited to see what you want to bring forward for us today, Amar, in the future forecasting. Over to you.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks, GNET, for the invite. I'm sorry to be the only one to have slides in this panel, but it helps me kind of think a little bit clearer. So I'm just going to go very quickly through three things that kind of keep me up at night. It's not working. Okay. First one, I think many of you have heard me talk about this before. It's the kind of ongoing issue of prisoners, ISIS affiliated women and children and men in northeastern Syria. The kind of camps issue that we talked about 2 years ago, a year ago, are very much still the case. This is Al Roj camp, as many of you know, a kind of smaller camp, a makeshift IDP camp with about 1,700 individuals. I'm not going to go through all the details of the camp, but it's safe to say that many of Western women and their kids have been moved to Al Roj camp. The second camp, of course, is more well-known, and it can only be described as a kind of emergency situation, right? It's about 64,000 people, over 53% of whom are under the age of 12. And when I visited last year, the only way to describe it is it's just a kind of sea of children, right? As soon as you drive up, there are infants and toddlers under every rock and under every tent. While some countries have repatriated their citizens, I think the whatever kind of vibrant policy conversation was happening in early 2020 was basically shelved with COVID and the pandemic, and it hasn't really surfaced again. But I think in the years to come, this is going to be an ongoing concern that we can't continue to kick down the road. The other thing, of course, to keep in mind, as Herrero Ingram and others have written, Iraq and Syria still are the main site of ISIS attacks well into 2020. There were numerous attacks in both Iraq and Syria. The shift of focus to parts of Africa now by the Islamic State are an ongoing concern. We had a beheading of 50 people recently in Mozambique, increased attacks in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and the arrivals of some foreign fighters as well in these regions. And so I think ISIS is still very much here to stay. And in terms of the kind of social media significance of it, there are ongoing fundraising campaigns on platforms like Telegram, Facebook even, where money is being requested to help fund a lot of the women that are stuck in these camps like Al Hol. And so that's going to be an ongoing concern. I'll skip this slide. Just to point out, of course, that it's an ongoing emergency situation that needs some sort of addressing. The second issue is what I've called kind of the second and third order consequences of COVID. And this is largely the kind of, COVID is a really good example, I think, and there's still not much research or thinking about the long-term consequences of what we learned from COVID and our response to COVID in terms of the violent extremism space. There's been some good work published on GNET and other platforms on how certain terrorist groups have responded or how certain movements have responded. But I think there's a larger conversation to be had of what COVID taught us about individual resiliency and communal resiliency and strain on mental health resources and how all of those were kind of important foregrounds or foundations for other kinds of consequences that happened. And what this means for future pandemics or future natural disasters and what that might, how we might respond to some of those kinds of things, right? And so the academic literature, at least around late modernity, is instructive here because I think it really taps into the nature of the global risk that we are now experiencing. Risks are really can't be identified without proper tools, which are very much part of the problem. Risks are universal. A forest fire in California drops ash all over Vancouver. There are no national boundaries anymore when we talk about global risks, and risks are irreversible. And I guess a good, often used example of this are kind of GMO crops. Once it's out in nature, it's really hard to kind of bring that all back. What this has produced, I think, at least in the short term with COVID, it produced kind of increased conspiratorial thinking. We saw with QAnon data on Facebook and Instagram basically skyrocketed after March 2020, right around the time of the pandemic. It's increase in lone actor violence, sometimes linked to groups like QAnon or movements like QAnon, but other times, like this case with Corey Huron in Canada, basically COVID ruined this individual's life. Everything around him fell apart. His business fell apart. His truck was about to be repossessed. Lockdown was creating all kinds of mental health issues and mental health strains on him. And he also fell down the conspiratorial rabbit hole very quickly and was tweeting and posting about Event 201, which was a kind of simulation exercise in 2019 that in conspiratorial circles proves that the pandemic was planned and carried out by evil elites. And so he drove to Prime Minister Trudeau's house wanting to talk to him about why Canada was shutting down when clearly everything was a hoax and nothing was real. And so the kind of interplay between moments of crisis, what that does to an individual sense of normalcy and being grounded in the world, and the kind of consequences that could come from that, I think will require a little bit more thinking in terms of what the lessons are from COVID for the next, insert crisis here. The third thing I'll leave you with is something that I'm more and more concerned about is the kind of a broad sense of what has been called kind of cultural loss If you look at the Hindutva movement in India, if you look at the treatment of the Uyghurs in China, treatment of the Tamil community and Muslim community in Sri Lanka, the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, far-right movements in Europe and North America, what they all tend to have in common is what Stanley Tambia called back in the day in the 80s with reference to Sri Lanka, a majority with a minority complex, right? So there's this kind of real sense amongst some majorities, groups in power in particular countries, that something is being taken away from them, that their position in society is being eroded, that their cultural or social dominance, that their rightful place in society is being eroded. And that sense of in-group danger is kind of linked to ongoing fault lines that are part of these countries' histories, but now also increasingly fueled by things that happen elsewhere, right? And a good example was what we saw in Gaza last week, which produced anti-Semitic acts in London, for example. So we live in a kind of transnational world now, and it's often accelerated by a lot of social media activity. And I think social media companies are now going to be, or are wrestling with, and will continue to wrestle with, what to do with kind of state or state adjacent hate speech and anti-Muslim or whatever group violence and hate speech that might circulate. But I think this notion of these majoritarian communities, people in positions of power, continuing to feel like somehow it's all very fleeting and going to be taken away from them, is inviting a certain kind of response, usually towards their domestic Muslim populations, that's going to be with us for some time, I think. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Again, bringing up three very big topics that are worth remembering. I mean, on that first front, again, foreign terrorist fighter repatriation. I think you're right that a lot of us during this COVID pandemic lockdown time period have maybe focused our attention elsewhere. And meanwhile, there's a huge number of people, and as you mentioned, women and children, especially children involved, that were never deciding to go and join a caliphate abroad or anything like that. And we do have some different cases, as you mentioned, different states taking different approaches to whether or not to repatriate and what that looks like, despite, I think, human rights law saying that it's illegal to make someone stateless. So we are in a bit of a ethical international conundrum with that one as well. I think really relevant for us to talk about what COVID means for shifts in violent extremism, especially with some of these groups that, traditionally speaking, we talk about violent extremist groups that start offline and then come online, but actually more and more we're seeing groups that have found their identity online. That goes back to the incel community as mentioned by our first speaker, but also this idea of some of the conspiracy theory networks. And then ethno-nationalism, again, not just an American phenomena, but looking at kind of Hindu nationalist trends in India, Buddhist nationalist trends in Myanmar. I think this is something that's going to definitely stick with us. All right, well, on to our third incredible speaker. John, what are you going to throw at us? John Lewis is a research fellow at the Program on Extremism, where he studies the evolution of white supremacist and anti-government movements in the United States and federal responses to the threat. He's also an investigator with the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center and provides assistance for the ISIS Files project. So you are spanning across the white supremacy to Islamist extremist spectrum as well. John, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to GNET for the invitation. Very excited to speak with you all today. Unsurprisingly, given my focus on white supremacist and anti-government extremist movements in the US, I think I've decided that that's the area I want to focus on for today. And I think really, when you look at 2020, it shows a lot of the frameworks of concern going forward in 2021 and beyond for those two strands of that accelerationist kind of set of networks. There's been a lot of really good work, both at this conference and elsewhere, on kind of the role of disinformation and kind of this broader context that Amarnath was alluding to. I'm going to cite Hararo Ingram for a second time in this presentation, which I'm sure he does not like, which is this erosion of the trinity of trust, right? Social trust, trust in authority, trust in democracy. And I think what we've seen is this continued misinformation, disinformation, malign influence set of campaigns, both from domestic actors like QAnon, which has been discussed at this conference very well as some of these other non-state actors domestically. And I think it's created this this ecosystem for many of these movements to thrive both online and offline. So very quickly here, I think, talking about the neo-Nazi network moving forward, I think a core misconception that was really uncovered is the connectivity and the role of groups versus networks. I think this is something that Alex Newhouse just wrote a really excellent piece for CPC on. And it really argues that, in addition to some work that Ryan Scrivens put out recently, that the role of Iron March, the role of Fascist Forge, the role of these very niche, very kind of off the beaten path online spaces that were really seemingly created to fill this vacuum pose a really significant kind of challenge going forward as this really central meeting space for a lot of these movements. We saw a lot in the beginning of 2020, a lot of offline law enforcement activity targeting both the base and Atomwaffen in the US. These are two nodes, I would really say, of this movement. And I think that there was maybe a belief after those kind of organizations moved away that there's this thought that the problem has been taken care of. But really, the problem is with these types of movements is that they're ephemeral. They are they claim to dissolve. James Mason came out in April of 2020 and said Atomwaffen is no more. There is no more Atomwaffen. Anything that's done can be claimed is not Atomwaffen. You recently saw law enforcement prescription rather by the Canadian government of Proud Boys, of the base of Atomwaffen. You've certainly seen some Proud Boys movements claim that they are dissolving. I would, as always, take any claims of dissolution with a grain of salt. I think the really significant challenge that has really been underappreciated on the neo-Nazi side is the prospects of travel. I know that we saw it a bit pre-COVID where there were a lot of discussions of travel to Ukraine, travel to link up with some of these neo-Nazi elements in that conflict. That's kind of slowed, obviously, due to COVID. I'm personally very curious to see how that changes going forward, because again, I think this is a set of networks that have evolved out of the Iron March network that are inherently transnational, but not in the way that I think a lot of traditional CT apparatuses are set up to understand. I think it's very easy to look at it and think this is kind of like ISIS core, this is kind of like AQ, when in reality it sits at a much kind of deeper, I think, area. And the other really interesting kind of evolution in 2020 that we saw was the Boogaloo movement, right? And I think that was really something that was mobilized by their ability to latch on to existing grievances, perceived or otherwise, in the kind of US cultural milieu, for lack of a better term. I think, you really saw them mobilize around these core grievances, whether it was the murder of George Floyd, COVID-19 lockdown, perceived government authority, and abuse of authority, as well as obviously a lot of dynamics related to the election and related to, again, this idea that government figures in themselves are inherently cannot be trusted, cannot be, have to be targeted. We saw that with the kidnapping plot with Governor Whitmer. We saw that with others. And I think that even as those core grievances go away, you already see new ones like anti-vax, conspiracy theorists taking the place in some of these movements. So I think that looking forward for the Boogaloo movement, it's already trying to evolve. You're seeing a lot of trends related to its use of like Instagram and moving into a lot of those influencer spaces and trying to kind of shine itself in a better light. And I think that that's really, a core piece of it is its use of coded language, its use of meme culture, its use of kind of jokes and this kind of gray area where it really makes content moderation difficult because, if the barrier is a really like explicit calls to violence, so many of them, and not just Boogaloo, but broader neo-Nazi white supremacists are so good at setting up the situations where it's like an in-group wink and a nudge. But unless you know what you're looking at, it's difficult to track. I'll leave it there, but looking forward to the discussion.
Again, some great points made. As a reminder, before we move on to our next speaker, please do throw some questions in. I've already got some good ones from the three that are there, although I saw one person cheekily put 3 questions in with their 1 question. So we've already got a healthy room for debate. John, some excellent points, especially the idea of groups versus networks. This is so difficult. It is so much easier to know who the baddie is if they have a swastika tattoo or if they're obviously holding a Black ISIS flag. But when we have kind of decentralized sympathizer networks or those fringe groups that don't really have strong group identification or that they're kind of amorphous, this makes it really hard for, not just law enforcement, but for social media companies to know how to define policies that aren't going to get into that over censorship territory. And again, picking up on some of Amar's points, that idea that this pandemic lockdown really has been kind of a pressure cooker for some of these ideas that anti-elite, anti-government, anti-vaxxer, and a bunch of other things that can spread so much more easily when we're kind of stuck at home and have a range of discontent. You brought up Boogaloo movement, which is a really fascinating one to dive into as well if people want to ask them questions, mainly just because accelerationism as a kind of ism for us to put our heads around. Some of Boogaloo was supporting Black Lives Matter. Some were staunchly supporting white supremacist movements and 3%ers, and all through a memification. So very much an online world surrounding that movement. Lawrence, are you going to fix it? We're coming to you. A lot of pressure being the one social media company representative among our experts. I'm sure you can handle it. Lawrence Woolley, for anyone that doesn't know him, is a public policy practitioner, not just a Facebooker, but has extensive experience in management of development project cycles on peace and security more broadly, as well as preventing and countering violent extremism, development of policy and programs. He's currently working at Facebook's policy team as a policy manager on the counterterrorism and dangerous organizations policy team, working on violent extremism and tech, processes of radicalization, PVE and CV programmatic efforts, combating hate and extremism online, internationally, including a focus on managing sub-Saharan African policy work with leading global programs work streams. Thematic areas of your expertise have included youth development, peace and security, countering violent extremism and counterterrorism, international relations and diplomacy, democracy and good governance, and particularly Africa's politics and transition of power. So we could go down a lot of different paths, but I'd love to hand it over to you to hear some of what you're doing.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Erin, and thanks to GNET for inviting us as Facebook. I will not attempt to answer all those questions, but very much looking forward to the discussions that are coming on. I think for us as Facebook and as a tech company, we'll look at the future of violent extremism in three ways. Firstly is the traditional binary enforcement of our policies that ensure that all entities that violate our violent extremism, terrorism, hate, and criminal orgs policies do not have praise, support, or representation on our platform, and the constant evolving ways in which we can learn how to make sure that that is efficient and those policies are comprehensive. Secondly is the element about the programmatic interventions that we then employ, from counter speech to alternative narratives to counter messages. Do they work? Do they have an impact? Do they have actual real change? And a constant learning around that in thinking at how the future of violent extremism threats are going to be. But thirdly is also just closing that practitioner gap, that policy, practice, tech, NGOs and governments, gap around how do we respond in a way that is, united, that can confront the root causes of some of these violent extremism threats, while just trying to make sure that we're keeping up with a very evolving nature of the threats. And we all know here that, the advent of violent extremism and terrorism content online is not a new phenomenon, but the reality and the explicit correlation of that and radicalization. Many researchers have said how passive consumption of terrorism content online may not necessarily have an explicit direct impact on radicalization. But because we all know about the interpersonal, the community influences that a lot of the violent extremism kind of threats line take. But the reality is that the violent extremism threats in of themselves are changing in nature, and we have to change with them. And one of the big, priorities that we have at Facebook is, first of all, just enforcing violent extremism policies. So, and this is a very robust, our definitions are very robust around behavioral signals and ensuring that policies are removing any praise, support, or representation of these entities, ensuring there's no coordinated work, ensuring there's strategic network takedowns, ensuring that also any support or representation and aliases of these kinds of entities are brought down. And we enforce a number of ways around this. We have a huge number of operative teams who are constantly interfacing with a lot of the content just to map out trends of adversarial shifts, new hate speech trends, new content moderation, ways in which some of these entities are trying to go around our, product policy interventions against them and how their content is being brought down. But also we have machine learning, which helps out with scale and speed in ensuring that whether it's image matching or former images of, some of these entities can actually be brought down way before they actually come to our community operations team to interface with them, or whether it's audio detection, or whether it's recidivism and ensuring that bad actors do not come back, with either multiple fake accounts and so on. And I think it's going to be, it is a journey tech companies have in ensuring that we are keeping up also with the fact that that very thin line between privacy and also ensuring that we are cracking down on terrorist content and content that actually has real world harm is something that we're constantly evolving in protecting our users and ensuring that our platforms are not a habitable place for these kinds of entities. Secondly is counter speech and the whole world around counter narratives, and we actually deployed very recently, and I'll invite everyone to check out this research, was a research around new models of counter speech, which was looked at sentiment analysis and behavioral changes, and it all looked at measuring the theories of change in audiences exposed to counter speech that go beyond the normative rudimentary reach and engagement metrics that we have. And I won't get into details of that, but that's it gave us insight on looking at audiences that are actually exposed to counter speech and what resultant effects actually come. And it helps us in our, kind of policy planning around counter speech, around looking at how models of counter speech are going to work. One of the flagship programs we have is a Search Redirect program, which looks at the more online safety intervention approach of, redirecting users to actual disengagement NGOs. And this is also an effort where we are saying, we are not a disengagement entity as Facebook. We're doing the binary work of removing content that is violating our policies, but we have disengagement NGOs whose work is to actually take these at-risk users who willingly actually make a decision to click through into, a disengagement NGO that actually offers support, outreach, education, counseling services. And we have this going on in a number of markets: US, Australia, Germany. We recently expanded to Germany and Indonesia, and looking into other markets expansion this year. And the idea here is that, can we do more in ensuring that the people who are actually doing disengagement are empowered, they're supported, and they actually have the tools to be able to effectively respond to, at-risk individuals who come to their websites. And then lastly is just looking at how we can ensure that our, programmatic interventions, our outreach, we are constantly, revising our policies to make sure they're more relevant. They have the language context, they have the cultural context, they are in touch and in tune with, the realities across the world. I mean, the insurgency in Mozambique is one. It wasn't a surprising one, but it just shows the reality, as Dr. Amarnath was mentioning. The reality of the changing nature of, terrorism, looking into more emerging markets that have porous borders, that have ungoverned spaces, that have, susceptible to religious, ideological, political, ethnic kind of factors that easily lead to radicalization and violent extremism. So we are constantly looking at, can we commission thought leadership research like what we did with the counter speech? Can we support people who are thinking and forward looking around the future of anti-extremism threats? We're working with Institute of Security Studies Africa to commission some research around the evolving emerging terrorism threats online, because we have to understand how the terrorist orgs are thinking, but also devise ways in which we can also see how our product policy interventions are not only relevant, but practical and can also address future threats. So I'll leave it there for now and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that. And obviously it's always easy to bash tech. It's in the media, it's visceral, it's in front of us, but it's also very hard to then fix it. Fix it, Lawrence, please. So when we're tackling this, I think it's really good to bring up, there's the policies and the tooling, which you mentioned. And I think a lot of people still, when we think of online tooling, we usually just think of photo and video matching, but you also mentioned things like recidivism detection, audio and logo detection, strategic network takedowns, which is a really fascinating way to not just have a whack-a-mole approach to removals of bad actor networks. And the fact that Facebook actually has its own behavior-based definition of terrorism, which is a little different to most other platforms, so that you can move quickly if you do see a new type of group coming out. But then also, as you said, recognizing that, censorship of content will only ever tackle a symptom, not a cause. So the idea that you guys are working on a bunch of these counter narrative models and also testing around sentiment and behavioral change, that's kind of the golden goose egg. It's not just a light and fluffy thing. Then we can actually see that this does have impact on audiences, and that really does rely on public-private partnerships. So it's not just, a private tech company doing it at its own, but actually having to localize those partnerships. Well, we have a range of questions coming in, and we've got a nice healthy amount of time to tackle some of them. Ronald, Marc-Andre, Maddie, Amy, Anonymous, some others, I think. Tom, I see your questions. I'm going to start fielding them, trying to do it in the order that they came. Some are more broad to all of you, some are specific. Dr. Phelan, I don't want you to get bored up there. You started. Let's kick it back to you just to make sure you're back in the game. We had a question to you about, really whether or not you see domestic violence against women as an indicator of susceptibility to violent extremism. That kind of gets back into that, causal or secondary factor, and what is the data or research that you're looking at? Tell us about that.
Yeah, Ronald, thank you for this question. It's a really hard one, and it's a really uncomfortable one, and I would potentially say that it could be. However, the reason why I say could is because there hasn't been a whole lot of research on the causality between domestic violence and violent extremism. But admittedly, this is also because, I hate to say it, it's often not funded. And this is, if we're to take this as, I guess, a research agenda going forward, I really think that there needs to be a significant research project or agenda to take this seriously. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because there has been cases of individuals that have engaged in violent extremism and do have histories of domestic violence. But as we often talk about, it's this notion of causality. And I remember once being in a conversation with a practitioner here in Australia who said, well, Alex, if we put domestic violence as a risk indicator in our existing risk indicators, we're going to be looking over here, but we may miss what's happening over here. And this is a real problem. What I would encourage is potentially to think about the role of domestic violence on 3 different levels. Does it play a role in relation to radicalization towards violent extremism? Is it something justified in the sustainment of involvement in violent extremism? Or potentially, is it something that comes out during disengagement and leaving? Are hostile beliefs something that exists before or come after or come in between? So there's a whole bunch of research that needs to take place. At present, with our work at GPS, my colleague's project that actually found that hostile beliefs towards women was the strongest indicator in terms of support for violent extremism in the 3 countries that they studied. And this is over socioeconomic factors, this is over ideological and religious factors as well. And this was consistent amongst women and men in some of the countries, even women that saw this. So I do think that there needs to be stronger empirical research to formulate and generate a strong, solid evidence base. But I do think that we're starting to identify that there potentially are links.
That's really, even for myself, and I have gender and radicalization as one of my expertise, but I did not know that trend would also carry over to women, although we do know that there are always women that join some of these very machismo, male-driven violent extremist organizations. So I'm fascinated by that. I think we could definitely, write the book and please send it our way, and let's send around some links in the aftermath of this. We've got a lot of questions to get through. One of our questions here for anyone that wants to jump in is around, the trend that is emerging. What are these trends and fringe that we should keep an eye on? And all of you mentioned some of these wonky trends that might be emerging, things that we want to keep an eye on, but maybe hone in on some of the group dynamics, and maybe John and Amar, I can pitch it off to you guys, because you started touching on how these group formations, the idea that they're more networky, the idea that some of them can go in a bunch of different directions ideologically, and yet they can unite in moments of violence in the real world as well. John or Amar, did either one of you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, so just quickly, I would say a couple things that come to mind. One thing that, I mean, just on the kind of technological trend going forward, I think one thing we saw a lot with Boogaloo mobilization is a really significant interest, not just in illegal firearm possession, but in the use and really seeking out 3D printed firearms, 3D printed firearm components, the use of some of this 3D printing technology to fill a gap where there may have previously been difficulty in getting firearms, whether due to felonies or drug use. A lot of these individuals, in addition to being extremely concerned about government involvement in their daily life, are very interested in the illicit ownership of firearms. Some of them have also talked about, it's really, you don't want to overstate it, but certainly they've talked about and expressed an interest in cryptocurrency. I think one kind of organizational thing that's really interesting, both online and offline, are there more with the neo-Nazi accelerationist groups and movements in the US rather, is that not only are they tying back a lot of their ideological framing to kind of the original neo-Nazi accelerationist James Mason siege types, but they're also taking a lot of, I don't know if part of it's gamification or just a desire to continue one-upping each other, but a lot of inspiration from the manifestos. And we've seen that before with Breivik, with Tarrant. I think when you have this very organic, leaderless space where, again, like despite some of the conversations where, the leader of the base, Ronaldo Nazaro, is in Russia, and Feuerkrieg in Estonia was allegedly led by a 13-year-old kid before being led by one of the US Atomwaffen members. I think that this, really leaderless space creates the conditions for not just that hierarchical spread of the ideology, but also, I don't know if bottom up is the right technically phrase, but this really organic growth of kind of the narratives and martyrs of the movement from the ones who take those offline actions.
Yeah, I would underscore all of that. I think the only thing I would add is there tends to be a trend. There tends to be a trend over the last little while that some of these movements or networks are coalescing by their reaction to world events, right? And so, if, for example, in 2015, you saw, even if they ideologically differed, they kind of all came together on the anti-Syrian migrant crisis issue or anti-Muslim refugee issue, and they shared resources, they mobilized together, they networked online, etc. Even though ideologically they might have been slightly different depending on group. I think January 6th probably is another one of these moments where different movements, ideologically distinct movements, are coalescing based on a kind of shared flashpoint event, right? And so I think I think one of the trends that is happening on the fringe, as the question asks, is can we predict or can we understand what kinds of world events are likely to make ideology or ideological distinctions maybe less important for the time being, and how that might move some of these groups forward. I don't know how to do that, but I think it's important.
Well, this is a good starting point. Maybe we can start a little gang around some of that. And, in relation to what you're just bringing up, there's a lot of questions around, okay, we've identified problems, how do we fix it? One of the questions to the whole group, although maybe Lawrence, I can kick it off to you, is around, what are some of the research and policy gaps that urgently need to be filled in the hope of being a little bit more proactive? And I'm not kicking that off to pick on you. Obviously, the research gaps are filled because we have GNET, so no, that we're on top of it, right? But the policy gaps are important, and I know that Facebook has been very open about talking about not being antagonistic towards regulation as a whole, but actually talking about smart regulation. And I think Nick Clegg is one of the big voices at Facebook that's kind of trying to say, okay, yes, regulation is needed, but let's do it while understanding the internet. What does some of that look like?
No, thank you very much, Erin. And actually, I mean, I'm sure many people know that we recently had an oversight board completely independent of Facebook that ensures that any question or any challenge around any content that was removed can actually be challenged in an open way in which we cannot even challenge. And I think there's a move. Some tech companies are moving towards transparency just to ensure that there's greater accountability and also greater ways in which we can learn from practitioners in a practical way, not just coming to them when we need to update our policy on hate speech or policy on dangerous organizations. And we do a lot of that, where we actually reach out because we value academics, experts, NGO practitioners who are constantly interfacing with these trends, with the emerging new contexts, with thought leadership research that is informing better programmatic interventions. And we do that, and there's a very huge element and part of our work at Facebook that looks into third-party policy outreach just to understand and learn better. But a few things and very explicit gaps. First of all, in programmatic interventions of PCVE, I mean, RUSI just did a huge study on the programmatic interventions in PCVE, took a number of examples, especially in sub-Saharan African countries where there's been an explicit belief where young people are being seen, this whole youth bulge is being seen not as an opportunity to galvanize knowledge and resource towards addressing violent extremism, but rather as a threat, simply because they've been bulked into one demographic that is socially, politically, ideologically disenfranchised from mainstream society, and then they're easily susceptible. But the reality is that a lot of that then makes a lot of the very little resourced programmatic interventions actually become counterproductive, as opposed to actually being beneficial and empowering to these young people in this spaces of conflict areas especially. And so a huge chunk of research needs to go on programmatic interventions that actually address the root causes of a lot of the susceptibility to violent extremism. And I think that in emerging markets is going to be a very huge thing that needs to be focused on, because the traditional way of, getting programmatic interventions that just give alternative narratives to at-risk people, young people in conflict zones is not working, and that needs to happen. A huge technical assistance to governments just to move away from this over securitization approach when it comes to I mean, I'm from Kenya, and whenever we've had a number of terrorist incidences in the country, there's almost like a huge shift into moving into areas where there's belief that there's young people who are capable of exacerbating such kind of acts, and then and it almost becomes befitting in the sense that it's not holistic in looking at how do we solve this across all the actors, and that's a common phenomena across SSA that really needs to be addressed. Yeah.
And that kind of brings us to some of the points that Dr. Phelan was making, and maybe we can come back to this with one of the other questions that was asked. And Lawrence, you brought up the fact, if we make the wrong arguments and oversimplify saying, oh, people radicalize because they are crazy or because they are poor, we are actually oversimplifying something that oftentimes those aren't the factors involved in a lot of the different processes of radicalization and trends that we're seeing. And Dr. Phelan, there was a question to you about, what can and should, and kind of in relation to the policy question, what can and should governments do to tackle gender inequalities and gender-based violence with the view of preventing it from being hijacked for extremist purposes? Would demonstrating the potential of gendered issues being linked to terrorism make tackling this more appealing to policymakers? Have we seen kind of any policy or government movement in this space recognizing some of those links?
It's actually quite interesting. I mean, I think there's a lot of work to be done at the government level, but for example, anecdotally, UN Women has been very supportive of our projects that have been looking into this. But I do really like this question, what should governments actually do with this view? And I would encourage us to think about, especially in the space of tech, if jihadist organizations and far-right organizations are using gendered constructs, gender norms, masculinities and femininities online to recruit, why aren't policies doing the same thing to disengage individuals or counter these narratives? And it makes me think about an interview that I had here in Australia with one of our nationalist socialist leaders, who I asked about masculinities and how he used masculinities to recruit and radicalize within his movement. And he was so versed in this. He was very easily able to tell me how he actually does this, and was able to come back at me with some counter arguments pertaining to feminisms, of course, overlaid onto neo-Nazi ideology. But the fact is, if individuals are doing this within groups themselves, I'm not still sure why existing policies are not responsive. So I would potentially add, and again, we need to be careful in terms of how we conduct our research, and we need to develop an evidence base. But I think that in terms of counter narratives, we need to start to really understand that femininities and masculinities do play a role. I don't agree with the point that women and men join terrorist organizations for the same motivational factors. I don't. I've conducted field work in Colombia with FARC guerrillas, former and active, with ELN, and just the diverse experiences of motivations for why women join are very gendered. And I think we need to really take this into consideration then in terms of not only providing counter narratives, but also narratives that promote women's agency. And I think to be able to do this, we really need to start to engage at the community level. Particularly in some of our research in Southeast Asia, we've found that engagement with the community level has really played a key role in providing, I guess, substantial approaches to integrating gender responsiveness in CVE and PVE initiatives. So I think joining this link is something that we really need to move towards a little bit more substantially.
I can just add something. I mean, Alex just made a very important point, because I think what tends to happen in sometimes public discourse or even some policy discourse is it's either, jihadi brides, or it's exactly like the men, right? They're basically joining for the same reasons that men are. And if they're not doing that, then I guess they're just being bullied into doing something or dragged into it by the man. And the kind of vast middle zone that exists that kind of makes women political actors is often ignored, because it has to be one or the other. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense, right? And I think that's a major gap or a blind spot that many of us have in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see it all the time that, when somebody says, well, they just ended up in Syria and it's because they were in love. You're like, they just couldn't find a local boyfriend. So they saw the beheading videos, but they thought, no, I'm just in love. It's such an oversimple. It's actually quite offensive to women to think we have so little agency and didn't know what we were getting into. And it's this kind of naive trope that gets layered on. So yes, women can be horrific violent extremists and big supporters of violent extremist movements as well. So I would call for that equality, definitely. Alexandra, I saw you went off. Yeah, come on back in.
If I could just add to that, at the same time, it's quite interesting because I remember a conversation with a former ELN female combatant that I had when I was in Colombia. And it was really, really interesting, her experience for joining. She had a family history of engagement in guerrilla groups. I mean, her family did this. And she explained to me that she knew that she wanted to join a guerrilla organization because she was a single mum and she had to support her son, but didn't know which one to join. And so she went to the AUC first, leveraged a salary, took that, went to FARC, actually hiked that, asked what FARC would offer, and then went to ELN, and ELN beat the wage that she was going to be given. So ended up joining the ELN. So, I mean, we can talk about these gendered constructs, but also sometimes it are these socioeconomic dimensions. Her experience was very real. Young single mum, had a child that she needed to support, and there wasn't a whole lot of mobility. And this was her reason for joining ELN. So I thought I would just add that. I'm sorry to interrupt this, but it's an interesting dynamic.
It's really, I mean, she boss ladied it, right? She just pitted the two groups against each other. I mean, gosh, you can't be mad. It's kind of impressive. It's in our field. It's so hard to be like, it's horrific, but as a researcher, it's really fascinating and impressive. John, I don't want you to atrophy out there. I'm bringing you back in the game. There's a question to you about, again, teasing out, distinguishing, if you do, between groups like Atomwaffen, you know, group identity movements versus movements. So these more lucid, you know, shape-shifting QAnon and Boogaloo type movements. So how are you defining and distinguishing between the two increasingly, or what advice do you have for us to try to define and distinguish between the two, especially since, you know, tech companies and governments are kind of having to very rapidly advance their policies, as Lawrence mentioned, to be able to get to the threat without trying to over censorship what might just be a broad, wonky social movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that touches on a couple of really important points. The first, I would probably defer to Mark on where exactly he places QAnon in this whole kind of weird mess. But at least in my own current conception, which inevitably in 6 months, a court document will come out telling me I'm wrong about this. But in the interim, where we sit, I think, is that I really consider Atomwaffen and the Boogaloo obviously distinct, but in their own ways. More networks, more movements, more maybe brands is a better kind of phrase here, in that, you know, the Boogaloo itself has a very distinct kind of set of brands, but it doesn't have an IS media dictating like here are the memes that you use on Facebook when you want to recruit people, and so that, you know, it obviously creates a very unique challenge, and I think one that you can very cleanly differentiate not from each other as much, but from the traditional organizations as we think about them in a kind of you know, government sense, where Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, right? They have leaders, they have a, you know, council of elders in some sense, they have national boards. You have individuals like Enrique Tarrio, like Stuart Rhodes, who in some senses are the movement, are like the embodiment of that group. And you don't have that same top-down kind of hierarchy. You don't have the same top-down organization. You have autonomy. And what that means is, when you look at the mobilization offline of even like Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, as opposed to Atomwaffen and the Base and the Boogaloo, it's quite different, and it's quite stark in contrast. You know, what we saw with Boogaloo and with the neo-Nazi groups were largely small cells that had met online in some form. You know, for Boogaloo, again, more mainstream social media, moved very quickly from there into an encrypted messaging platform. And then again, you know, the flash to bang there is very quick. Whereas, you know, organizations and groups, especially Proud Boys, especially Oath Keepers, I think operate not only in a quite different kind of, you know, countering kind of CT perspective, but also just in the way that they recruit, the way that they operate, the way that they plan and organize kind of offline.
I mean, in relation to that, especially as we're seeing kind of this more brand more than core group orientation, Lawrence, pivoting back to you, you know, in this memification world that we're seeing, the Pepe the Frogs, the where we go one, where we go all, when we're red pilling and blue pilling, and I don't know what pills people are taking these days, but they're spreading. What are the efforts to create kind of counter memes? You know, these are what we see traditionally with some counter narratives is NGOs take kind of a long time, they're well developed, but actually with these quick fire memification, what are the efforts looking like to counter memes or alter extremist memes or appropriate them for CVE or disengagement purposes?
No, thanks. And this is it's a constant thing that we're, you know, thinking and working with practitioners also and within our policy teams to actually just ensure we are as relevant. But just going back, before I even address that, just going back to the behavioral kind of definition of our terrorism, you know, definition. I mean, there's the rudimentary, whether it's premeditated, whether it's you know, coercive violence, you know, against civilians who are out of a conflict zone. But there's also the religious, political, multiple ideological kind of behavioral perceptions and ideologies that are also, looking at intimidating society with that kind of, kind of ideological, change and influence. And so a lot of white supremacy groups are actually terrorist organizations. QAnon, for example, we were very fast to ensure that there's a QAnon informed treatment module where anybody who searches for hate-based terms related to QAnon and white supremacy terms and neo-Nazi terms is actually redirected to our disengagement NGOs, but also to our research NGO that gives more information that debunks these theories. And a huge chunk of our work has also been going into violence-inducing conspiracy networks and the impact they actually have in inoculating users, in creating actual, false narratives that are then believed that actually lead to real world harm. So that is something that we are constantly very, if you look at the Holy Germany attack, at Christchurch, all of these incidences are categorically, are put on our terrorism radar, and all the praise, support, and representation of such content is actually removed from our platforms. But coming just to the countering of narratives, I think at the end of the day, it's us constantly learning at what are the behavioral changes, what are the sentiment analysis, behind the metrics that we normally have on counter-speech interstitials, for example. So beyond you just saying an interstitial that leads you somewhere, what is it that research is telling us around, retention rate will go, by almost 80% by a lot of the users who are at that periphery of trying to maybe find out, keywords about the oath keepers or QAnon and so on. And while that is also one thing, there's thought leadership research we're constantly doing around and testing also, can we have product policy interventions that actually offer help, around whether you have seen a friend who potentially, is having kind of, a behavioral change and you'd want to actually help. There's safer ways in which we are creating our product policy interventions to respond and make it possible for our users to actually, report on this content, but also take good action that is within the very rights and privacy of the users themselves. So it's a constant learning journey, and I think we very much depend on also, researchers and academics to also constantly help us co-create some of these narratives.
Can I just add? For a question like that, I think it's important. There are certain questions that researchers can answer. But I think a question like this, like social media companies have more data than we do, right? And there was a lot of activity taken, Trump's tweets were flagged, for example. If you searched for QAnon on Instagram, it would send you to GNET. And all these kinds of redirect strategies were employed. But we actually don't have any of the stats on whether any of that worked. We don't have eyes on the metrics that came out of some of those initiatives. So it'd be good to know from Twitter's perspective, Facebook's perspective, Instagram's perspective, what happened with all of these initiatives, right? And whether they actually had results.
No, thank you very much for that. And if I can just quickly jump in, we actually had a review of our first two search redirect modules, which is based on the search redirect method and the get help module from our search terms in Australia and the US. And actually the report is out there for anyone to actually get to see. It's in our counterspeech.fb.com site. Under resources, we have that report that actually evaluated the first set of our search redirect program. And we are constantly doing comparative evaluations, performance evaluations of our existing and expanding search redirect modules. So we're more than happy to even get feedback from some of those reports that have already been put out.
And there's definitely always going to be a call for more data so that researchers can give adversarial shifts, but that they can also have the data to be able to understand, this is a very chicken and egg fluid cycle of needing more data, understanding threats, feeding back, being able to influence tech companies. So the job is only ever 1% done. Is that not a Facebook slogan, I think? So we all have job security for likely all the wrong reasons. We're all going to keep on tackling these very difficult subjects. We're starting to come up on time. And so there was a question that was actually put out to Amar, but taking us back to this kind of future forecasting lens, I think it's actually very appropriate for the entire group to kind of some final remarks around, It's been a tumultuous year plus with a pandemic situation. What are our panelists' thoughts about the future of violent extremism, particularly in a world where we will be divided between countries and regions who have been vaccinated or have been at least offered vaccination, some taking it up, some not, versus societies that have not had much access, that are still struggling with the pandemic and inoculation? What does this mean for trends in violent extremism potentially? Recognizing we don't have the psychic app. I'm sure there's an engineer in Silicon Valley aiming to get that done, but what do we think that's influencing, and what do we think that means for future forecasting in violent extremism to date? And maybe we can start with you, Alexandra, if you have some thoughts.
Oh, it's a really good question. And admittedly, I know this is a really silly thing to think of off the top of my head, but if I think about violent actors in Latin America, particularly those that are engaged with the drug trade, interestingly enough, COVID had such a significant effect on drug routes. And, a lot of actors needed to start to diversify, which is one of the reasons why some groups started to money launder through crypto. So I'll be interested when we start to reopen up how this plays into the realignment of actors throughout this region. We saw that with, stay-at-home measures, that some organizations actually use this opportunity to expand and also begin to leverage social controls themselves. So I think what's going to be interesting in terms of that is, going forward, those effects of COVID, and I guess the strengthening of some of these actors, when we open back up, will they be able to maintain their leverage and control in the areas that they gained? And I'm sorry, that was the first thing that came to the top of my head, but it was interesting how significant the cocaine trade was disrupted this year, like other markets were as well, right?
Yeah.
So yes, that is my contribution.
Yeah, and it's really important for us to keep an eye on different regions like LATAM or Sub-Saharan Africa and what that's going to mean. John, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think just sticking kind of domestically here, I think what we saw in 2020 was a really massive offline mobilization around kind of the COVID lockdown, COVID restrictions, all of that. And I think that what we're seeing in early 2021, at least in a lot of the white supremacist neo-Nazi spaces, is a shift from COVID denialism, COVID conspiracy theories into anti-vax, and then those related conspiracy theories. And I think that one thing that's really interesting to keep an eye on is, traditionally, I think in the past 7 to 8 years, you had a lot of, maybe not necessarily the neo-Nazi groups, but groups like Proud Boys, groups like Oath Keepers, who mobilized in that kind of like, protectors of kind of rights, kind of, you saw it with a lot of the Kim Davis stuff, Malheur Refuge, Bundy Ranch, with Oath Keepers especially. Obviously in 2020 with the Boogaloo, you saw a lot of explicit desire to seek out areas of civil unrest, to engage in violence, to incite violence, to get to that end goal of societal collapse. And so I think as we reopen, it's been really interesting to see what fault lines, what conspiracy, what disinformation comes out domestically as it relates to kind of vaccinations and as we start to reopen. And I think that could be an interesting flashpoint, both for the more traditional groups as well as kind of some of the accelerationists who are hoping to take advantage of those trends.
Yeah, absolutely. Amar, do you want to piggyback off of that?
Sure. I mean, I think what we're noticing, some of the work that Marc-Andre has done and some of the memes that Mustafa Ayad at ISD keeps sending me is that there is a kind of movement or a spread of some of these conspiracy style thinking around the world, right? And so there are basically Arabic translations of Bill Gates conspiracies or Arabic translations of QAnon content that are pretty prevalent on social media. And so that's an ongoing concern for me in the sense that we know that particularly in the last 2 years, COVID conspiracies, as John said, have been kind of, and I hate this word gateway, but they've been kind of gateways to broader networks of conspiratorial thinking. And then to take that one step further, we know conspiratorial thinking has massive social consequences, right? People are less likely to vote. People are less likely to vaccinate their kids. People are less likely to volunteer. People are less likely to donate money. And so the kind of consequences of simple conspiratorial thinking, which used to be on the fringes of the internet, is now more mainstream. are huge. And so I think that's going to have a long-term impact. I'm not sure what that's going to look like, but the one I'm not so concerned about anymore is the vaccine stuff, because I think as the vaccination rates increase, and as people that you trust and know personally start to get vaccinated, some of these anti-vax beliefs do tend to fade away, right? I mean, my aunts and uncles were, I would classify them as anti-vax until my parents got vaccinated and nothing happened for 4 days. And they're like, oh, okay, I guess I'll get mine too. And so I think more and more that happens, those numbers will go down, but the broader consequences will still remain. And I think the wave of that will eventually reach shore sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And last but definitely not least, Lawrence.
Thank you so much. I think it's been an interesting journey for especially for tech companies, because with people being more home, even in low penetration, emerging markets, you find that people are more online or finding ways to be more online. Of course, you found dangerous entities taking advantage of that, and moving from this whole kind of grievances framework that they use, anti-government, theories, anti-state, because people are more empowered and are more exposed to information. Information is spreading a bit more. We are doing quite a bit in tackling misinfo. I think COVID-19 misinfo work that we did with WHO was quite superb in just ensuring all this anti-vax, reality about COVID and is actually taken out, but also redirected towards WHO that has huge resources to actually give credible information. But then it was interesting, if you just look at the SARS campaign in Nigeria, for example, you got over 9 militia groups, for example, uniting to support the citizens anti the government. And for once, you could even find young people who were like, oh wait, I thought these are militia groups, but they're actually helping us to fight a cause against the government. And those, like small borderline ways in which, some of this, terrorist orgs and militia groups are taking advantage of the fact that if there's instability, we will flourish in giving new narratives. And I think we all of us as practitioners just need to learn with the fact that, changing times call for just change ways of addressing these kinds of, conspiracies and so on. Thanks.
That's a great point to end on, just that idea that, every crisis brings about opportunity structures, and that could be net neutral. And it's just about who's willing to put in the work, whether it's violent extremists or counterterrorism practitioners. And, that's a perfect way to end this. Thank you everyone for dialing in. Sorry for the questions we couldn't get to. You were posing some fantastic questions, but some of them might just be answered in a GNET Insight. So go onto the GNET website, have a look. We can get back in touch. And I would be remiss not to say a big thank you to the Global Network on Extremism and Technology, particularly Alexandra Bissenduth and Johanna First, who did all the logistics, all the reasons you guys got to be here in the first place, as well as Shiraz Maher and Charlie Winter for leading GNET forward. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to the GNET crew. And thank you so much to my panelists. What a fascinating discussion.